Hello and welcome to Alita Dogma Shades of Murder, a podcast where I will share and discuss tales of true crime, mysteries, and all things dark and macabre. If you eat plain dreaming shades of murder like me, then welcome, my kindred spirits, to your new podcast home. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow or subscribe on your streaming platform of choice, share and rate, so I can present more stories to you, and we could all embrace the love of the darkness together. All of my social media and contact information you can find in the episode description below. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case, and may not be intended for all audiences. Women who defy traditional gender norms that were created, fed to us, and are still reinforced by the patriarchy are commonly punished in our society. The assigned feminine qualities of being nurturing, ladylike, domestic, and submissive create a stigma attached to women who do not meet these standards. Women are penalized for not fitting within gender-based expectations by society at large, and by extension, through our criminal justice system. Research has shown that judges and juries often give greater leniency to women who fit within the boxes of mother and housewife, but such chivalry does not tend to extend to women who do not fit within this mold. Acts which go against the ingrained societal beliefs of women being maternal, caring, and empathetic are often punished more severely because the female offender has failed to comply with socially constructed gender values. Studies reveal that minority women, women who are in lower socioeconomic classes, females who identify as LGBTQ, or who in some other capacity have rejected their assigned societal role of being a mother and a wife, are the female offenders most likely to face the death penalty. In the previous episode, I discussed the chivalry of the courts, which worked highly in the favor of Mrs. Lyda Trueblood many times over. But in this story, a young woman is penalized to the fullest extent of the law, not just for her crimes, but for going outside the bounds of expected female behavior. This is the case of Janeen Marie Snyder. On April 22, 2001, in Rubidoux, California, the body of 16-year-old Michelle Curran was discovered lying inside a horse shed on a woman's ranch. Naked and bruised, the young girl had severe ligature markings around her wrists and ankles and had been shot at close range in the head. Days earlier, the owner of the ranch had spotted a female stranger on her property and had called the police for trespassing and for what she believed to be a robbery in progress. The police located and arrested the couple as they attempted to flee the horse ranch, due to the fact that there was a lot of blood found in the barn which they had been inhabiting. They were consequently held on a $1 million bond. It would be several days later when Michelle's body would be found. The perpetrators had tied the petite and very pretty high school girl to the rafters of a barn. She had been visibly beaten, sexually assaulted, and then killed. Not long before Michelle Curran was murdered, the police released a picture of Janeen Marie and the girl sitting together inside a beige GMC Suburban, which was identified as being registered in Michael Thornton's mother's name. The Polaroid taken of the two girls had been discovered inside a hotel room in Rubidoux, California, where the three of them had stayed. It was never determined as to whether Michelle had initially left of her own free will with these predators, or if she was forced to from the beginning. The photograph itself did not indicate any signs of stress, or that Michelle was being held captive. However, a search warrant of the vehicle would later reveal guns, handcuffs, bungee cords, rope, and a Velcro strap with what DNA later determined to be Michelle's hair attached to the inside. It was believed that while in their captivity, Michelle was forced to use narcotics with the couple. This was most likely to decrease her resistance to them when they sexually abused her and used a gun to scare and intimidate her into staying with them. Janeen Marie Snyder was only 21 years old when she was charged, along with her then 45-year-old boyfriend Michael Thornton, of first-degree murder. During the 3.5-month-long trial, the judge and jurors would listen in horror about the terror and abuse experienced firsthand by two teenage girls who were lured in by Janeen and her boyfriend Michael Thornton on separate occasions. These two brave young women testified to how Janeen Marie was utilized as bait. They shared how Janeen used being another young girl to her advantage, pretending to befriend them in order to entice and trick them to go with her. Once the girl was successfully fooled into leaving with Janeen, she was hand-delivered to Michael Thornton, who would be waiting at a nearby motel or even at his house for their arrival. The girls separately testified as to how they were force-fed drugs, sexually assaulted, and their lives continuously threatened if they attempted to leave or were to ever tell anyone what had happened. The testimony of one of the victims, who wanted to stay anonymous, was that of a 14-year-old girl. The defense presented San Bernardino County Sheriff Sergeant Deborah Bauman to convey to the court the horrible details of the girl's time in captivity at the Rialta home of Michael Thornton. For a long, hellish month, the girl was held captive by Snyder and Thornton. She shared with the sergeant how they intermittently fed her meth and hallucinogenic mushrooms by drugging her meals, and then would sexually assault her once the drugs had taken effect. The young girl soon became addicted and began having cravings on her own. She told him how she had asked to go home at least 60 times, but the couple had threatened to kill her family in front of her if she dared leave them. Michael Thornton told her that the only way she would be leaving them is if she were dead. Once, she did attempt an escape from her perpetrators by climbing through the bathroom window, but Michael Thornton caught her. She confessed that there were other times that she could have escaped, like when she was taken out to a restaurant with Michael Thornton. But she was so heavily drugged most of the time that she was unable to ask for help or to leave on her own. The young girl also admitted that she felt like she had sexual intercourse with both Thornton and Snyder, but that she was so frequently in a mental fog because of the rampant drug use that she cannot be positive either way. She also revealed to the sergeant that on one particular occasion, she suddenly became conscious enough to watch as the couple laughed at her because they had just had sex with her, but she didn't know they did or remembered it happening. The girl had reported her abduction and rape by the two defendants back in 2000, but the San Bernardino prosecutor's office did not pursue any charges against the suspects due to a lack of evidence. How infuriating would that be for the victims' loved ones to know that these two dangerous offenders could have been taken off of the streets if the word of this young girl had been enough to prosecute them. The investigators had also identified several other young girls who they had stalked and had been targeted as the couple's next victims. These facts were used to illustrate how calculated the defendants' actions were and how they had all intentions to continue being sexual predators and murderers of more young girls. There was additional testimony as to their crimes committed, which was provided by the psychiatrist who interviewed the female defendant, Janeen Marie Snyder. During their session, Janeen had confessed to the psychiatrist about her involvement in the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a 14-year-old girl who had gone missing in 1996, named Jessie K. Peters. According to the defendant, she lured Jessie away from her home and brought her over to Michael Thornton's house, who sexually assaulted the young girl and then drowned her in his bathtub. He then proceeded to dismember her body and disposed of her remains into the ocean off his boat. Michael Thornton's former wife testified as to how she overheard him discussing how he had murdered and chopped up a young girl and thrown her body parts into the sea. The offenders were never charged with the abduction and assault of the two teenage girls, nor for the murder of Jessie K. Peters. The evidence was not offered in vain, though, because the testimony of the eyewitnesses and the horrific confession made by the female defendant about the murder of Jessie K. Peters helped to secure a successful case for the prosecution. The defense counsel attempted to paint Janeen as a victim of coercion and abuse from the many years of manipulation by her much older boyfriend, Michael. However, it was determined by the court that she was not a victim of her male accomplice, and that she fully participated in the commission of the crimes she was charged with. Further, the evidence presented by the prosecution proved that it was Janeen's hands that held the gun which brutally stopped the life of 16-year-old Michelle Curran. On September 7, 2006, Janeen Marie Snyder and Michael Thornton were sentenced to death for the rape, torture, and murder of Michelle Curran. Technically, California is still a state which allows prosecutors to pursue the death penalty as a sentence. However, after a federal court declared its use of death by chemical injection to be unconstitutional, no one on death row has been put to death in the state since 2006. In 2019, supporting the premise that it is critical to prevent innocent lives from being lost to the death penalty, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a moratorium, effectively halting all executions. With 737 individuals on death row, California has the largest number of prisoners who still await their fate. Between 1973 and 2007, California and Texas, with 18 in each, were the top two states which led the nation in the highest number of women who have been given a sentence of death. As of 2023, there are 21 women on death row in California. It is interesting to note that out of all the women on death row across the country's prisons, 61% of them are white, and around 40%, which comprises the largest percentage of other age groups, are between 20 and 29 years old. Men who have been found guilty of capital murder are 6 times more likely than women to be given the death penalty. Research has demonstrated that there is a quote-unquote female victim effect in relation to the sex of the victim of a violent crime and the subsequent criminal punishment. The gender of the victim and the gender of the offender also appear to be strong variables in sentencing. When women were the victims of single victim capital cases, the death sentence rate was 10.9% compared to 1.5% when men were the victims. Women who have been given a death sentence were most likely to have victims who were other women versus when their victims were men. The killing of a white woman in particular has been shown to result in a much higher likelihood of being given the death sentence versus cases of homicide when the victim was male or of another race. Other variables which have been shown to affect the outcome of a capital murder case have been the sexual assault of the victim, the absence of criminality of the victim, and the number of aggravating factors involved. The 1978 Briggs death penalty law made the death penalty in California the broadest and toughest capital punishment law in the country. The manner in which first-degree murder is committed has an impact on an individual's sentencing. The California Penal Code utilizes a wide definition of capital murder, which includes 33 special circumstances in which first-degree murder becomes eligible for the death penalty. These encompass such circumstances as felony murder, which is a homicide that intentionally or unintentionally occurs during the commission of a planned felony, such as burglary or rape, multiple murders, financial gain, and torture, amongst many other circumstances. Studies have shown that there are 2 specific circumstances that juries find to be more aggravating than others, and as a result, an offender convicted of first-degree murder has a much higher chance of the jury recommending a sentence of death. The first is for the circumstances of multiple murders, and the second is when the defendant has been proven to have inflicted or intended to inflict physical or psychological harm to the victim beyond the killing on its own. These will include cases that involve the kidnapping, torture, mayhem, sexual assault, or rape of the victim. If it can be shown that the murder was done in a quote-unquote especially heinous, atrocious, cruel, or exceptionally depraved way, like through a torture killing, then this would also qualify for capital murder under California statutes. For capital cases that fall within the realm of one of these 2 special circumstances, there was a death sentence rate of 14.4%. In contrast, for cases that did not include such aggravating factors, the death penalty was handed down in only 1.6%. It has been documented in cases of rape murder that the offenders are punished much more severely than if it was determined to be a crime of passion, domestic violence, or a familial-based killing. Of all the special circumstances that involve the additional infliction of pain and suffering placed upon the victim, rape murders are the most likely to induce the death sentence. For a defendant who was convicted of the murder and rape of a single victim, the chance of receiving the death sentence was 16 times the rate of capital murder cases that did not have the special circumstance of rape. For single victim rape murder cases, the death sentence rate was 31.7% compared to 2% for other single victim capital murder cases. In California, the rate of offenders who are determined to have raped and murdered their victims is almost twice the percentage of defendants who were convicted of multiple murders, and 3 times for a defendant who killed 2 people. The extensive amount of the death penalty being utilized under this specific set of circumstances is undoubtedly the reflection of patriarchal society's intention to protect the purity of women's bodies. Research shows that when this gender-specific societal rule is violated, the penal outcome for the offender will be severe. The special circumstances of kidnapping, sexual assault, torture, and the abuse of a minor were contributing factors to the death sentence Janeen Marie Snyder received, and under this statute, the penalty was legally justified. Theory on female criminals has not been a heavily studied area in criminology, and was largely ignored until the 1990s. What has been analyzed are the different ways in which males versus females deal with strain. Robert Agnew's strain theory is one of the most popular criminological theories to explain what triggers an offender to act. It holds that when an individual is placed under strain or stressors, whether it be financial, heavy emotional blows, or disruptions in their life, this can induce negative emotions, such as rage or depression, which can push someone into criminality. It involves 3 main reasons to explain what may drive someone to act in delinquent or criminal ways, due to their having poor coping mechanisms. The first is when a person feels they have failed to achieve or reach a specific goal. This could be something such as when a person fails out of college or loses their job. The second involves the removal of positive forces in someone's life. This could include events like the death of a loved one or the end of a marriage. The third kind results from negative forces or elements of one's life, such as living in poverty, being abused, or being uneducated. Through this theory, it is suggested that based on the distinct dynamics of gender, women will likely be less aggressive and less destructive than men who experience strain, and will thus be less likely to act out in a criminal manner. In the 1996 article, Gender and Crime Toward a Gender Theory of Female Offending, it was noted that both male and female offenders are more likely to have experienced poverty, a lack of education, poor or negative parental figures, abuse, weak social bonds, and delinquent associations. For girls, the gender-based patterns of socialization they are exposed to create the foundation for them to be victims of sexual abuse, exploitation, and harassment. This victimization is most often the primary variable that triggers delinquent behavior in girls. In hopes of escaping an abusive home life, girls are often faced with life on the streets. This increases their vulnerability to drug addiction, alcoholism, and sex-based transactions with others, whether for money, shelter, or even simply their next meal. The role of interpersonal victimization for women increases some women's paths to intertwine with criminal behavior, which directly increases their chances of being victimized further. This pathway to female criminality is escalated even more so for minority girls and for girls in the lower socioeconomic classes. Janeen Marie Snyder was subjected to repeat victimization and trauma beginning in her childhood. Brought up in poverty by a single mother who had a known drug addiction to methamphetamines, Janeen was neglected and was exposed to her mother's drug and alcohol abuse and sexual activity from an early age. When she was 14 years old, her mother's boyfriend sexually assaulted her, and in response, Janeen's mother threw her out of their trailer and onto the streets. Many studies have shown that women often commit criminal activity out of urgency, and as a mechanism of survival. Young, uneducated, and alone, without any support or income, Janeen fell into prostitution, became addicted just like her mother was to methamphetamines, and was essentially homeless at 14 years old. Out of genuine concern for her safety and well-being, one of Janeen's friends asked her parents if she could come to stay with them because she had nowhere else to live. Michael Thornton, her friend's father, was a 41-year-old highly successful owner of local hair salons. Almost immediately upon her arrival, he set his eyes on Janeen. Not long after, Janeen, a 16-year-old homeless, drug-addicted street prostitute, would become involved with this father and married man. Their flirtation quickly escalated into a sexual affair and mutual substance abuse, which, needless to say, created major conflict between Janeen, her friend, and her father. As a result, Michael Thornton chose Janeen over his wife and over his own daughter, who would both eventually move out of the house. Research on women who commit criminal offenses, especially the most serious of acts, has revealed the predominant role of the male as a cohort, influencer, or initiator. These findings have suggested that many women partake in crime in an effort to foster or protect an emotional connection or relationship, rather than their drive to violate the law on their own. For girls and women who do not have close familial supervision, which equates to social control, nor any positive social bonds, whether it is through sports, hobbies, or some other group or organization in which they're engaged, they have a much stronger likelihood of being exposed to criminality. This, of course, greatly increases the possibility of their being directly involved in delinquent, even criminal behavior themselves. Research has shown that female murderers most often kill their intimate partner or their children, but rarely do they target strangers. This reflects how most women who commit murder do so in the context of survival for themselves or for their children. For all extents and purposes, and as officially defined by the FBI, this couple was a pair of serial killers. Know whether or not you are in the school of thought that a serial killer is defined by an individual or multiple people who kill 2 victims on separate occasions, or the magical number is 3 victims, which I personally subscribe to. Janeen and Michael were bound to fulfill the serial killer definition if given the opportunity and time. They were highly motivated and inspired, if you will, to seek out new victims. Their relationship became increasingly more deviant and twisted over time. Michael coached Janeen on how to lure in young high school girls so they can manipulate them into having sex and doing hard drugs with the couple. What once may have been a perverse game between the couple that involved drugs and sex with minor girls, who may or may not have consented to some or all the behavior involved, quickly escalated to acts of the vilest kind. Their behavior spiraled out of control and culminated in the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 2 young girls, Jessie Kay and Michelle Kern. The opposite of the chivalry of courts is what is referred to in criminology as the quote-unquote evil woman theory. This theory explains that such chivalrous and thus lenient treatment of female criminals is exclusively reserved for those women who appear to be submissive and feminine and are therefore perceived as being in need of the court's protection. Research supports, as defined by the evil woman hypothesis, that in addition to the criminal penalty of the offense imposed, the law further punishes a woman for not meeting the societal expectations of feminine traits and failing to have a maternal nature. Research on female sex offenders has found that when their accomplices were male, society frequently placed the predominant blame upon the man under the premise that the woman was under his manipulation and had been threatened or coerced by him. This process attempts to minimize the criminal culpability of the woman in the eyes of society so that it can more easily digest the vile actions she has committed. This process was not applied to Janeen Marie Snyder, and she was blamed and treated by the jury and the judge to be just as responsible and revolting as her male cohort Michael Thornton was. To this belief, and thus how she was perceived and ultimately sentenced by the courts? I disagree. Please, don't mistake my sympathy for the circumstances of repeated trauma and abuse in Janeen Marie Snyder's life as an excuse for her crimes, but it is important to perceive this offender through the lens of her life experience. Knowing what this woman endured from such a vulnerable age and how the only support system and stable force in her world was Michael Thornton, a child predator, one can see how her life unfolded in this dark and uncontrollable way. Janeen was treated as disposable by her own mother, who threw her out on the streets to fend for herself when she was still a child. She chose to accuse her young daughter of seducing her adult boyfriend instead of acknowledging that this grown man had taken advantage of a vulnerable child and raped her. From what is known about their relationship, Michael Thornton treated her better than any other person in her life ever had. He gave her a home, food, companionship, and what she interpreted to be love. Michael Thornton is a true sadist, a manipulator, and a thrill seeker to the point where he had to escalate his sexual gratification and games of power to the point of abducting, raping, and murdering little girls. Again, I will repeat that no circumstances a person is exposed to or experiences in their life ever condones another human being doing what Janeen participated in. But I don't think it is warranted, nor is it so simple, to call her evil. This young woman never had any mediating influence of a positive support system. It is highly likely that Janeen's mental health and her related capacity to make right and moral choices was extremely impaired. Janeen was uneducated and abused sex and drugs from a very young age as a method to self-medicate herself from the repeat victimization she was subjected to. The offender was still a child herself, whose cognitive development had not fully matured when she became involved in this highly toxic relationship with a man almost 3 times her age. Janeen was very impressionable and extremely vulnerable to being seduced and manipulated by a much older man who encouraged her to further abuse narcotics. Michael Thornton could have chosen to present himself as a paternal figure to the young girl his daughter had brought home to help, but instead, he was nothing but a sick predator toward her. He used her vulnerability, addiction, and desperation for attention and love to convince her to help him commit perverse acts of sex and violence against other young women. I don't believe she would have ever been led down such a dark path if it weren't for her horrible excuse of a mother and Michael Thornton entering her world. The mental, physical, and psychological abuse Janeen Marie Snyder experienced by her homelessness, prostitution, drug use, and abuse does not condone her actions on any level, but it helps to understand her desperation and her distorted perception of life. Her crimes were atrocious, disgusting, and twisted, and she deserves to be incarcerated for a minimum of 20 to 30 years for her involvement in these crimes. It may be controversial to express, but I do not necessarily believe that Janeen Marie Snyder should be in prison for the rest of her life, based on the mitigating circumstances of her age, her horrendous background, and the way she was used as a tool to fulfill the sick fantasies of a much older and extremely manipulative man. Michael Thornton should have been charged with the rape of a minor, in addition to being charged with supplying drugs and alcohol to a child, instead of being considered her boyfriend. It honestly surprises me that neither his wife or his daughter ever reported him to the authorities when they knew he was sexually involved with a teenage girl who was not of the legal age of consent. Janeen Marie Snyder also gave the prosecution valuable information as to the murder of Jesse Kay when she confessed to her psychiatrist, which also, in my opinion, was indicative of her guilt and remorse in the events. From what I could gather through my research, she acknowledged her involvement in both murders. So why was she not offered some kind of plea bargain for this admission? There are countless cases of first-degree murder where the defendant is offered a plea bargain if they admit to the charges of a lesser degree, which they are then sentenced on. I am shocked that her defense attorneys did not collaborate more with the state to make some kind of agreement. Based on the facts of her childhood and her severely toxic lifestyle, which she was thrown into at such a young age, how was this not used in her defense? It is true that her defense attorneys attempted to negate her culpability by the fact that Michael Thornton had manipulated her from such a young age. But I don't understand how they did not discuss all of her traumas and how that molded and shaped her mindset. In my opinion, her defense counsel did a terrible job for her, especially since they did not pursue a more extensive psychological evaluation of her mental health. Now that she is on death row, I don't doubt at all that her mental wellness has been completely ignored. And realistically, she is probably more messed up in the head than ever before. If our prison system was based on rehabilitation and reformation, or even made it a small priority, with extensive therapy and counseling for her mental health and drug addiction, in addition to being given the chance to become formally educated, there is a possibility in time that she could have become a positive functioning member of our society. Of course, since our criminal justice system centers around punishment and deterrence instead of actually helping reform and rehabilitate offenders and giving them tools for successful reentry into society, we will never know if this could have been the case for Janeen Marie Snyder. I have to question whether her crimes were any more hideous, more depraved, and immoral than other female murderers were, that they warranted the death penalty? Take Lyda Flypaper Trueblood, the woman I just shared with you last episode, who poisoned, from what we know, at least 5 of her husbands, her brother-in-law, and her only child for monetary gain. But she was only given a 10-year prison sentence. Or what about the many women in our modern age who have murdered their own children, only to be placed in a mental health hospital, and some who are now walking around without any record or restrictions on their freedoms? These female offenders had little to no mitigating factors which justified the leniency of their penalty, except that they were either moms or had the label Mrs. in front of their names. The chivalry of the courts did not fare well for Janeen Marie Snyder, who was handed the penultimate criminal punishment when the jury recommended the death sentence and the judge agreed. Granted, she most likely will never face execution, being that she is on death row in California and is currently in the appellate process as we speak. It does seem quite evident to me, though, that she was severely penalized, less so for her crimes than for not being a proper young lady and for failing to wear the label of wife or mother. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate your being here with me, and I'm beyond thrilled to be your host. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts and feelings on this perpetrator and this case. Do you believe that Janeen Marie Snyder is where she deserves to be, waiting out the rest of her days on death row, wondering whether California will ever resume executions? Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder unfolding in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. Alita Dogma's Shades of Murder was created, written, researched, and edited by Alita Dogma. Music composed by Ashrat Danilian, courtesy of Pixabay.